Hi, in this lecture, we're going to finish out our study of the brain. We're going to start with something called the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is known as a functional brain system. And the reason it's called that is because it's not located in one specific area of the brain. It mainly is found in the cerebrum and that Diencephalon, which is kind of that middle portion of the brain. And you can see it here in this kind of yellowish and purplish types of colors. So it has several important functions for us. One of the main things it does is our emotional response. So emotions come from the limbic system. It also helps with motivation. It links our conscious functions. So think about our executive brain or higher brain with the cerebral cortex to the unconscious like emotional responses of the brainstem. And it also has an important function in memory, both storage and retrieval. So if we look at the structures of the limbic system, you can see them listed here. We'll be talking about the cingulate gyrus. So you can see it's called the limbic lobe in green. You can see that's on the cerebrum. You might remember the corpus callosum there. We're going to talk about something called the fornix, which is shown in yellow. So we go to this picture down here. You can see the fornix a little easier. The cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus is shown in pink here. Hippocampus, for some reason, someone looked at that and thought it looked like a seahorse. That's how it gets his name. We'll talk about the mammillary body, which is right here. There's two of them. So whoever first discovered those thought they looked kind of like little breasts. So they call them mammillary bodies. And then we're going to come into the olfactory bulb and tract. These are the structures that kind of look like a Q-tip on the inferior portion of the brain. The other one that gets probably a lot of, you probably heard before of, is the amygdaloid body, or the amygdala, which is shown in purple here. Notice that kind of wraps around. So those are the pieces we're going to touch on for the limbic system. All right, so we have this lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, and it has that gyrus. So we've learned a couple gyri. We learned a pre-central gyrus and a post-central, remember, in the front and the back of the central sulcus. This is called the cingulate gyrus. It's right above the corpus callosum. And so this has several functions. Just to give you an overview, we know it's involved in emotional processing and vocalization, especially if it's a painful emotion. Think about how you sound when you're hurt or in pain. It helps with making decisions and proofreading. It's really good at finding errors and then fixing them. We also know, though, it can be involved with anxiety and ADD. We know when it's not as developed. You see this more in autism, depression, ADD. Because again, it's harder to, if you think about people with ADD as far as making decisions and proofreading and finding errors. And they also have found it helps with communication and dealing with change. So that might explain its link with autism. Now, the hippocampus is the thing down here that I said looks supposed to look like a seahorse. This is number one function, memory. So when we consolidate memories, when you learn things throughout the day and you try to store them for long-term memory, they all get processed and stored in your hippocampus. So that's our memory area of the body. So again, we have the limbic lobe with the gyri, and you can see the picture here. The next thing, and you see the hippocampus as well, associated with the memories. Now, the next one is called the fornix. So I changed the picture a little bit. The fornix is just a tract. Remember, a tract is a bunch of axons. It actually is Latin for arch because it kind of looks like an arch. You can see it here, this yellowish structure. See how it wraps around? And so it's a tract. It's basically forming connections between that hippocampus, which is shown in green here, and the mammillary bodies. You can see the two of them right here. So it's a tract that relays information between those two. And so it's going to help, again, with processing a lot of times with memory and communicating between those two structures. And we'll talk more about the mammillary bodies in just a minute. And by the way, I've seen the word mammillary body written with 2 M's, and I've also seen it written with 1 M. So it doesn't matter to me. Pick whichever one you want to use. Okay, so now we get into the amygdala, or the amygdaloid body. This is the one you probably have heard of before. It links your emotions with memory. So any kind of emotional memory, whether it's traumatic, right? Especially traumatic memories, fear-induced memories, but also with the really, really happy memories. So it connects those together and helps us form those. It helps process our fight or flight response, especially it's like your threat assessment center. So it's constantly scanning your environment looking for threats. And if it sees a threat, it automatically is going to trigger a very strong reaction to that without having any input from your cerebral cortex, which isn't always good, as we know. So the amygdala is in the temporal lobe. And so it helps with some of the functions you already learned of the temporal lobe. So it does help with memory, again, especially emotional memories. And it processes all fear. So again, it's our automatic response to any kind of threat. And so what happens is there's some sort of stimulus that comes in, again, assuming it's something that might be fearful. And when that stimulus goes in, it goes directly to the amygdala first. And then the amygdala prompts the reaction. It doesn't go to the cerebral cortex right away. So for example, if you see something scary, so in this example, it's a scary pumpkin. Maybe it's a snake, right? So you see something scary and you immediately like, oh my gosh, right? And your fight or flight goes up. You might react. You might say something. You might try to fight it. If you see a snake. And usually you can't speak for it happens a moment later, right? Think about any time you've been afraid, your immediate reaction is your fight or flight, and that's your amygdala response. And so what happens is the amygdala turns it on, and it can form memories to that. So if it was a very, very, maybe you had a really horrible memory of the Halloween or a pumpkin or something, then you're always going to feel that way when you see that trigger, right? We talk about triggers causing these really strong memories. Those are usually due to the amygdala. Now, the prefrontal cortex job is to kind of send information up and say, hey, everything's okay. We can just a pumpkin. But it gets stored that way in your hippocampus. And so this explains like PTSD and triggers when they cause this surge and this huge anger response or fight or flight response that can happen. The other interesting thing is we know it's affected by testosterone. You're not memorizing this whole graph. I thought it was kind of interesting. So boys at puberty, increased testosterone. If you've ever raised a teenage son, you have seen this happen. They will get so angry in a second. You can look at them wrong and boom, right? We call it the pufferfish experience. They just boom, go into a pufferfish. So that's because testosterone makes the amygdala more sensitive to any kind of threat. Their executive functioning, right? Their prefrontal cortex is not developed at, 13, 14, 15, 16. And so they're going to have these strong overreactions because of the testosterone surges and become very angry in a flip of a switch. And, when you lift weights, you release testosterone as well. So especially if they have a really good workout, you could just say, can you unload the dishwasher? And it turns into this attack. So if you raise boys, you see that, and that's the testosterone effect on the amygdala. And it does, as the executive functions, as they mature, it does help to lessen that effect, but it might help you. It'll go away. It won't last forever. Okay, the other part of the limbic system is the olfactory bulb, tract, and cortex. So we know that this functions for smell. And when we look at olfaction, information comes in and then it sends this into the limbic system. And so this helps explain how maybe oils or flowers or perfumes can cause us to feel relaxed. They say peppermint might make you feel more awake and alert. Lilac is supposed to help you sleep at night and help calm you. So there is a link between our sense of smell and our limbic system and our emotions. And that's the link for that part. Also, you can get memories from certain smells. So maybe you have a certain flower and you smell it and it brings you back to maybe you grew up in an area with those flowers. And then the mammillary bodies, remember you can see one here. These are the things that looked like little breasts or little round pieces that you'll see them in part of the limbic system. And so one thing we know they help with is they help with processing memories, especially things called episodic. That's a P. So what's an episodic memory? It's your personal memory. It's basically the memory you form of an event from a personal experience. So maybe it's your memory of Christmas or a birthday party. And we know that our experiences kind of filter our memories. And so it's just basically how you personify or how you emotionally remember that memory. Now, mind-body connection is really important here because we have the limbic system and it's linked into the hypothalamus. We haven't quite talked about the hypothalamus yet, but it's one of the main control centers of the body. And so what that means is that your emotions directly affect your hypothalamus because remember, the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system. And when that happens, it can make us sick. And when these illnesses are called psychosomatic illnesses, they're real. They're real diseases, but they're caused or exacerbated by stress. And you can see a whole bunch listed here that you've probably recognized before. And so it can cause disease. It can affect our hormones. It can affect our blood vessels, our heart rate, our respiratory rate. And so the best way to treat these is to try to go to the heart of it and try to remove the stress, right? Try to find ways to de-stress, whether it's prayer or meditation. We know exercise is really good. Maybe listening to music, laughing. All of these things are going to help decrease your stress level. We also know, as I mentioned, the cerebral cortex, we have the limbic system down here, and it's tied into the cortex and the frontal lobe, right, our executive function, that they're always communicating back and forth with each other. And so it takes time for those connections to form and for basically the frontal lobe to be able to kind of control the limbic system, right? Think about a 2-year-old. They have a temper tantrum if they don't get their way. Hopefully, you no longer have temper tantrums when you don't get your way, because your frontal lobe is able to control those emotions, right? So they're inappropriate, and we have ways of dealing with those strong emotions. And so there's a link between these. Now, you might know people that it seems like their cerebral cortex is like too strong of a control, and they don't seem emotional at all. But there's a link between these structures of our brain. Okay, the Diencephalon now. We are going into kind of this whole middle part of the brain. And the Diencephalon has 3 things in it. It has something called an Epithalamus. Remember, epi means above. It has the thalamus, which is basically this whole circle. It looks kind of like a circular area right dead center of the brain. And then we're going to have the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus. Hypo means below. So you find the thalamus. It's this light purple color here. And there's a couple structures above it for the epithalamus, and there's some structures below it for the hypothalamus. So when we look at the epithalamus, there's 2 things I want you to recognize here. One is there's a choroid plexus. That's that red thing. A choroid plexus, remember, makes cerebral spinal fluid. And we see one on all the brain models. They're in every ventricle, but we can see this one. The other thing is there's going to be this little thing that looks almost like a little pimple on the back, posterior side, and that's the pineal gland. Now you can say pineal, pineal. I've heard it pronounced a bunch of ways, but the pineal gland makes a hormone called melatonin that we'll be talking about later. And you probably know that melatonin helps you sleep. It also might make you hungry, and it responds to light. And so when the sun is out at high noon, our melatonin levels are very, very low. And then as it gets dark, our melatonin levels rise, and that's what makes us feel sleepy and tired. And we'll talk more about melatonin when we talk about the endocrine system. Now, we look at the thalamus. Again, it's this circular area, dead center. It actually has 2 lobes to it. It has 2 pieces. So if we drew it from an anterior view, it kind of looks like a dumbbell. So you have the 2 lobes of it, and then the thing in the middle is called the intermediate mass. So that's the piece, it's gray matter that holds them together. Now, when we look at a midsection of a brain, we see it right there in the middle. So it's called interthalamic adhesion is the newer term. I am fine with intermediate mass. If you really want that word, knock yourselves out, but intermediate mass is okay. So in the thalamus, we have the 3rd ventricle, remember, with the cerebral spinal fluid. And what I want you to know is think of it as the traffic cop. All sensory information, except for smell, goes to your thalamus first. So it's all coming in to your thalamus, and then your thalamus sends it to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex for interpretation. And think about all the information we're bombarded with right now, right? Touch, smell, vision, hearing, taste. Maybe you're having a snack right now. All that comes in, and it has to go to the proper area for interpretation, so you're aware of it. And, they say that it filters about, like 98% of all incoming sensory information. So it's a really important filter, because we would be overwhelmed if we were aware of everything around us, which is kind of an interesting thought, right? They say that LSD affects the thalamus and its ability to filter. It no longer filters, and that's why people have these hallucinations. But it's kind of interesting concept if we're filtering 98%, what's out there around us. Not trying to freak you out. Okay, hypothalamus is where we're going to spend the most time. So the thalamus is the circular area, so therefore the hypothalamus is the whole area below it. And the hypothalamus has a lot of really important functions in the brain that we'll be going over. So how do you find it? Well, there's something called the optic chiasm, which you'll see is a little white piece. It's actually where the optic nerves crisscross. They cross over each other, the right and left cross. Chiasm means cross. And so you can see a piece of that. And if you find that mammillary body, remember the thing that looks like a little breast? Technically, the hypothalamus is this whole area in between those two structures. Does a lot of important functions. So, oh, by the way, the hypothalamus connects to the pituitary gland through something called the infundibulum. So this is the pituitary gland, and there's a little piece that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, and that's called the infundibulum. So you can see it a little better in this picture, and you can see the pituitary gland right here. And then the infundibulum is known as the stalk. So it connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus controls that pituitary gland. That's one of the reasons it has so many functions in the body. So it is the headquarters of your autonomic nervous system. It controls the entire autonomic nervous system. And remember, the autonomic nervous system controls everything you don't have to think about, right? Your cardiac, respiratory, digestion, everything. There's a few centers we'll mention in the hypothalamus. There's one called a vasomotor center. Remember, center is a cluster of neurons that have similar functions, and they're always the cluster of cell bodies, and they're inside the CNS. So there's a vasomotor center, and that controls your blood pressure. And as you can guess, the cardiac center is going to control your heart rate. And there's even respiratory centers that control your respiratory rate. So it's very, very important. Headquarters the autonomic nervous system, and we learn about that in our final exam unit. It is responsible for all hunger, appetite, body temperature, eating, and it makes these hormones called orexins, and those are things that can either stimulate or inhibit your appetite. So there's two hormones that really affect these things. There's ghrelin and leptin. So leptin is here and ghrelin is here, and these are the two we're going to talk about. So think about ghrelin as making your stomach growl, because when your stomach growls, you're like, I'm hungry, I must eat. So ghrelins nickname, by the way, it's called the dieter's worst nightmare, because, or the diet, well, that's what I call it anyway, the dieter's, because what happens is it's stimulated by dieting. What's dieting? If you decrease food, if you decrease caloric intake, you release ghrelin. And when you release ghrelin, it comes from your stomach. It tells your brain, feed me now. I'm really, really hungry. And so if you've ever, been in a lab or in a class and you skipped breakfast and you're really, really hungry, you'll notice you eat a lot all of a sudden. In fact, we tend to eat faster than we need to when we eat extra calories. That's one of the reasons behind dieting and, grazing. So, one form of changing your diet is to eat smaller amounts of food more often. Now, it's got to be good food, right? We're not talking about eating candy bars. But what happens is that if you keep that up, then you decrease your ghrelin levels. And then leptin's the opposite. Leptin comes from your fat cells or adipocytes. And so this is going to make you feel full. So it decreases hunger and it helps you burn fat and makes you feel full. And I don't know why, but when I was researching some of this, I saw that if we don't have enough of these orexins, it's associated with narcolepsy, right? Where you basically have many, many periods of falling asleep during the day. Now, the other thing it controls here is because it's part of the ANS, we said heart rate, respiratory rate, pupil size, your pupil reflex, thirst, sex drive, body temperature, and all of your circadian rhythms. It makes two hormones, ADH and oxytocin. ADH is a very important hormone that basically increases your blood pressure. It's called anti-diuretic hormone because it decreases your urine output. And what that means is it makes you pee less. Well, if you urinate less, all that water goes into your blood. So what happens is your blood volume goes up. And if there's more blood, right, because there's more water, so there's more fluid. When you have more fluid, think about inside a garden hose, that's going to raise your blood pressure. And we're going to come back and again talk about these in the endocrine system. Oxytocin, you might have heard of by the drug name Pitocin. And one of its functions is to stimulate labor and delivery. It's also the hormone associated with love and maternal bonding. And we'll be talking about that later. It also does our subconscious control of skeletal muscles, just like facial expressions we make when we're mad, when we're happy, when we're in pain. As we mentioned, it's part of the limbic system. So again, this is why the emotions affect the hypothalamus that can cause the disease that we talked about, the psychosomatic disease. And it causes our sleep and wake cycles, which I kind of had up here, but sleep and wake, which we'll talk more about later. Okay, so now we're moving down to the cerebellum. This is that extra lobe. To me, it looks like a little piece of cauliflower. So your cerebellum is your main control center for muscles for posture, things you don't have to think about. So subconscious muscle control, balance, proprioception. So, it's a fairly small piece of the brain, but it has a lot of neurons. You have in your notes about half of all neurons. So if we look at the cerebellum, the one thing we'll notice is it's right here. It's separated from the cerebrum by the transverse fissure. So remember, a fissure is a deep groove, and the transverse fissure is what separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. Now, if we look at the cerebellum, it also, again, is going to function for proprioception, and proprioception is joint awareness. So it's basically just knowing where your joints are, being able to close your eyes and touch your nose, for example. And I'll come back to that in a minute. A couple anatomy things here. It has two hemispheres, so there's two pieces to it, and they're held together with a structure called the vermis. And then you'll see that it has all these folds. It's a folded appearance. That's just called folia. So those are the folds of the cerebellum. It does have an outer cortex. So the cortex, just like the cerebrum, is the outer gray matter area. It's just called the cerebellum cortex or cerebellar cortex. Whereas the white matter is inside, and it kind of is in the shape of a tree. So it's called the arbor vitae. And so let me go back to that picture, and I'll try to draw this in white. So the internal white matter is branched and tree-like, and that's known as the arbor vitae. So again, we talked about the functions of this thing, how it's going to really be important for proprioception. Go to this picture. Here's a close-up so you can see a little better with those arbor vitae. We're not learning any other of the anatomy of this, just the basics that's in your notes. And so there's something called ataxia, and ataxia is trouble with usually walking or balance. It's due to problems with the cerebellum. Now, this could happen from trauma. It could happen from a stroke. It probably most commonly is going to happen from alcohol. So when you ingest alcohol, it goes right through the blood-brain barrier. And when it gets to the cerebellum, it causes issues with balance and coordination. That's why the sobriety tests rely on those. So can you close your eyes and touch your nose? You should be able to do that with a normal cerebellum. Can you walk a straight line? So all of those tests are done because they're assessing any impairment in the cerebellum, which will definitely happen with too much alcohol. Okay, the brain stem, remember, has three parts, something called the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So the midbrain, again, I'm going to circle. Here's the thalamus. Okay, here's the hypothalamus. And the midbrain is this area back here. When we look at the midbrain, it gets a little more complicated. We're only going to talk about a couple pieces. The pons is right here, right across from the cerebellum. And then the medulla oblongata, remember, is the lowest part of that brainstem. So when we look at the midbrain, we're kind of going like right through, right below the thalamus. There's a section, and you can see there's a whole bunch of different structures here. We're not too concerned with every one of them. But what I do want you to know is there's something called the tectum, and we're going to focus on in the tectum is something called the corpora quadrigemina. Well, I apologize. I hope that didn't scare you with my dog freaking out, but it actually works perfectly for this part of the lecture, so maybe she planned it. The corpora quadrigemina has 4 rounded bodies. There's 2 that are superior, and there's 2 that are inferior. So the superior ones are called the superior colliculi, and the inferior, there's your superior, and then your inferior are going to be the ones that are below. So what do? Well, they process the reflex movements of your eyes and your head and your neck to stimuli. So the superior colliculus processes these movements in response to vision. So for example, if a bright light was shown in your eye, you'd probably close your eyes and look away. The inferior is what might have just happened when my dog barked. It's in response to an unexpected sound. So, when you heard that, you might have startled, right? Your startle reflex. If you're home and you hear a strange noise, or let's say you hear a gunshot, you're going to turn and look in the direction. So the inferior processes the auditory response, and the superior is processing your visual responses. In your notes, by the way, I just went back and saw that I missed a blank, and just know it talks about the brainstem. And the other thing I want to mention is that it also contains that fourth ventricle. So you'll see the fourth ventricle between the pons and the cerebellum. And then remember, the cerebral spinal fluid flows from the fourth ventricle down inside the spinal cord in the central canal. So I apologize for missing that. Okay, back to the midbrain. The other thing that we find here so you have the tectum and the tegmentum. I don't get too caught up in memorizing those, but I do want you to know the colliculi are part of the corpora quadrigemina, and then something called the substantia nigra, and this is an area in the midbrain. This is where dopamine comes from. So its job is to make dopamine. Now remember that dopamine is going to go up to the basal nuclei, and then that's going to be inhibitory. It's going to control them. And the basal nuclei, remember, control muscle contractions. They make sure that they're nice and smooth. They prevent unwanted movement, like if you're reaching for something. And so if you start to run out of dopamine, then you have trouble with your muscle contractions. And so this is the tenet of Parkinson's disease, is that these neurons get damaged and they don't make dopamine. And so then it affects muscle movement. And we'll talk about that in the clinical section. If we come down to the pons, pons is Latin for bridge, and it's basically a bunch of tracks. So there's longitudinal tracks, which sound just what they do, up and down, ascending and descending, and transverse tracks. So if we look at the pons, you'll see that there's tracks that are going up and down. So basically, the pons is the bridge. It's connecting information from the medulla and the spinal cord and bringing it up to the thalamus, to the cerebrum. Then you also have tracks that run transverse. They run back and forth, and they're basically tying in information from your spinal cord or medulla and sending it to your cerebellum. So it's the bridge basically between the medulla and the spinal cord and the other areas of the brain. It does have some centers, and it actually has a respiratory center as well. You don't need to know its name, but it does have some of your centers for breathing. Now, we look at the medulla oblongata. This is the lowest part, most inferior portion of the brainstem, and it blends into the spinal cord at that big hole. Remember, the foramen magnum is where it's going to join with the spinal cord. Now, as far as the medulla, remember that the cerebral spinal fluid is going to pass behind the medulla and go into the central canal. So you have the central canal of the spinal cord continues into the medulla, where it comes up to form the fourth ventricle, or where it joins with the fourth ventricle. And I'll show you this picture here. You can kind of see it here. Let me show you a better picture. We'll go back to the brain picture. So remember, it comes right up until it goes into the fourth ventricle. Now, the medulla has a couple important functions. Obviously, it's part of the brainstem, so information going out to control heart rate, respiratory rate pass through the medulla oblongata, so damage to the medulla would affect them. But we also know that the motor tracts decussate here. So that's a fancy word for, it means cross over. So when we talked about the precentral gyrus, we called these pyramidal tracts in previous lectures. Remember, these are the axons, I'll just keep using blue, that are coming all the way down from the cerebrum. And then they cross over to the opposite side in the medulla oblongata. So the decussation is just a fancy way of saying this is where all motor information crosses over to the opposite side. Now, we're not memorizing all the centers, but we do have some centers in our medulla oblongata as well. We have the same centers we saw in the hypothalamus. Basically, the hypothalamus controls these functions, and it sends information to these centers in the medulla, and then the medulla sends it all the way out to the corresponding organs. So damage in the medulla will definitely affect these functions because you can't relay the information. And then we have the reticular formation. This is another functional brain area because it's not located in just one area. So you can see with the dark purple here where the headquarters of it are. So it tends to go from your midbrain, your lower brain, your midbrain, pons, medulla, even down to part of the spinal cord. But then what it does is it has axons, it stimulates the cerebral cortex. So it does help communicate or link the cerebral cortex with the spinal cord. It helps control muscle tone, but it also forms what's called the reticular activating system, or RAS, and that activating system is the actual action potentials to the cerebral cortex. So what it is it's this system that's constantly sending information to your cerebral cortex to keep you awake and alert. So its job is to keep you awake and alert, conscious, and it is very important in our sleep and wake cycles. So it obviously would affect sleep and wake. We also know that caffeine stimulates this area of the brain as well. So this is another reason, like caffeine and other stimulants can stimulate the RAS and make you feel more awake and more alert. What if it's not working? Well, if it's not working as well, we have what's called an under-aroused cerebral cortex. So you're not able to pay attention or concentrate. So you would expect issues with learning and memory. If it completely failed, this is what causes a coma. So if there's damage in this area, some sort of brain trauma, then it can't keep keeping the cerebral cortex awake, and then that would be a coma. And they say, patients in coma, sometimes they come out, sometimes they don't. They say that you can still hear when you're in a coma, but a coma would be depression of this particular area. Now, if it's too excited, then you see these excessive startle responses. They're hypervigilant, restless, hyperactive, would be associated with too strong. So this is an image of the brain, and we're going to be studying all these in our lab, but I just wanted to go over a couple things with you. So we can see the cerebellum, and then the white matter here. See how it looks like a tree? And I'm going to be abbreviating. That's your arbor vitae. I can see the medulla, and the pons is where the pin is. Now, what I see here are two bumps. You see the two bumps? The top one is the superior colliculus. The bottom one is the inferior colliculus. So that's what they look like from the view. I have the fourth ventricle here. I can see a mammillary body, so I circled a mammillary body, and then that little brown thing, looks like a little brown nipple, that's your intermediate mass of your thalamus. I can see my corpus callosum here. This is my septum, remember the wall that separates the ventricles, and this right here is my optic chiasm, so I can see a little piece of that as well. Normally there's like a pin or a piece of metal here for the infundibulum. Sometimes they pop out of the brains. I can see my transverse fissure. Again, just abbreviating, there's not a lot of room here. I can see my parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay. I can see my central sulcus. And if I see the central sulcus, then I'll just do a 1 and a 2. So 1 is my precentral gyrus, and 2 is my postcentral gyrus. Remember, 1 has the pyramidal cells and controls every skeletal muscle in the body, and 2 is all sense of touch, comes in there. Now, this whole area here is the thalamus, the round area. This area is the hypothalamus. And that pink thing is going to be a choroid plexus. So they usually color it red or pink to represent it's the blood, because remember, cerebral spinal fluid is formed from the blood. And then if I come back to my colliculi, my superior and inferior, the little bump right above it, that's my pineal gland. This we don't do. Okay, so you can kind of see where that is. And then if I use the blue again, I'm going to draw in the cerebral aqueduct. So see how that channel brings down to the fourth ventricle, and then that would send it down into the medulla and finally into the spinal cord. This little white thing here is the fornix. I always think it looks kind of like a hockey stick. So this is a lot of the brain structures that we'll be studying, and I just wanted to go over it with you quick. So that concludes our lecture on the brain.